very first, Howard T. Odum was the very first reference in the first book on permaculture, Permaculture 1. So it really was a foundational influence on the role of energy in all processes. And that's what we're going to focus on today. And it's what I think is so important. Nate Hagens, if any of you are familiar with his work, he talks about energy blindness, that we're all energy blind. And this is one attempt to help heal energy blindness, is for us to become more literate about the role of energy in all systems. And another aspect of what Howard Odum taught was this principle he called the maximum power principle. And the few people that I hear talking about it nowadays, I always feel like they're emphasizing one side of it and not the other side of it. So I want to give a little bit of attention to that as well. Toward the end, we'll have a little bit of practical application, in terms of like having this background gives us an ability to kind of create a checklist for sustainable systems that we can apply. So all of this informs principles we can use in any of our systems that we're trying to address, and a checklist, a starting checklist. Now, I think all of us in this group are aware of the big issues that we're trying to deal with. And you can see that this slide, I was starting to say earlier, this presentation was originally created in 2009 when I was just finishing a permaculture course at Inspiration Farm. And I ended up sharing this at the 2009 Washington State Permaculture Convergence. So this is a bit old, which you can see like in this slide where it's showing a population of just above 6 billion. We all know we're now somewhere above 8 billion population. Time magazine front page in the year 2006, telling us, we need to be very worried. Here's Time magazine from 2019. But to bring this up to date, I just put this slide in. This came out, I just saw this in my Facebook feed. Global sea surface temperatures on November 3rd just set a new record for the number of standard deviations above the 1982 to 2011 mean. So you can see kind of we're off the charts just this week in terms of sea surface temperature. Our global economic system, represented here by the New York Stock Exchange. I've heard it said that for some reason we can more easily imagine the extinction of the human race than we can actually changing our economic structures. What does that tell us? Oil discovery trends has been in decline for many, many years. So we really have resource concerns. All of these crises are converging. And James Howard Kunstler deemed it the long emergency. And so David Holmgren said in his book, Permaculture, Principles and Pathways, he said the real issue of our age is how we make a graceful and ethical descent. So again, this is a summary of a 1994 essay by David Holmgren called Energy and Permaculture. I put the link to this article in the chat. There's two places it's online right now. One is at permacultureactivist.net and the other is at resilience.org. And this is what David Holmgren looked like circa 1994. As you might guess, he now has a lot more gray hair. Okay, so this is how the article starts. He says, the sustainability debate has shown a deep confusion about the processes and systems which support life and humanity. The lack of conceptual tools to incorporate previously ignored environmental givens into the calculations used by economists and decision makers is painfully obvious. There are no simple answers to the complex questions of costs, benefits, and sustainability. However, there is a natural currency we can use to measure our interdependence on our environment and assist us to make sensible decisions about current and future action. That currency is energy. So most of us, I hope, know about the first and second laws of thermodynamics. The first law states that it's the law of conservation of energy. Energy is neither created nor destroyed. The energy entering the system must be accounted for either as being stored there or as flowing out. And the second law is the law of degradation of energy. In all processes, some of the energy loses its ability to do work and is degraded in quality. The tendency of potential energy to be used up and degraded is described as entropy, which is a measure of disorder which always increases in real processes. So a little bit later, we're going to be talking about Howard Odum's proposed fourth law of thermodynamics. A little teaser there. So the work of ecologist Howard Odum provided a theoretical framework and conceptual tool which was critical in the development of the permaculture concept, according to David Holmgren. Howard Odum lived from 1924 to the year 2002. And here are some photos of him at various times of his life. Howard developed the field of systems ecology. He was a real pioneer. And the areas of interest that he included in his studies were human and environment interactions. So, not just studying the environment, quote unquote, by itself, but how do humans interact with that, and how are we part of the environment? What is the relationship between ecology and economy? There's a great paper that Howard Odum wrote in, I think it was like 1974, perhaps, called Energy, Ecology, and Economics. It's another presentation I hope to make available some point in the future. He talked about energy as currency. It's something that flows through all processes, and it's something we can use as a value measure. And then he developed this concept that he ended up calling emergy as an environmental accounting system. So it's a measure of energy used in the past, or embodied energy. He found that people had different concepts of what embodied energy meant. And so he came up with his own term, M for embodied, and ergy to make this word emergy. So some of the books that he wrote in the more readable layman's terms, 1971, he published Environment, Power, and Society. 1976, he published a very readable text called Energy Basis for Man and Nature. I highly recommend it. It's a bit hard to find nowadays. And then I'm not sure exactly what year it was, perhaps in the 90s or late 80s, Environmental Accounting, Emergy and Environmental Decision Making. This is one book that I have not read, and I understand it's a little bit more dense and maybe for people with some level of expertise. But then another book for the general public, A Prosperous Way Down, was published in 2001. A Prosperous Way Down, Principles and Policies. And it's kind of an update of this previous book, Energy Basis for Man and Nature. Again, I highly recommend it. And then there was an update of his Environment, Power, and Society book that was published right after his death and finished by some of his previous grad students in 2002, I believe. Again, highly recommended. So Howard Odum's ecosystem approach, he saw the world system as energy systems networks. So he analyzed ecosystem elements and the processes in terms of energy flows, storages, transformations, feedbacks, and sinks. So that text there in blue, I'm going to repeat that several times in the presentation. If there's one takeaway you might get from this, is to remember these 5 elements of that energy flows, it stores, it transforms, it feeds back, and it sinks. And it incorporates non-living and living elements of the natural environment. And it incorporates human systems and economies as an integral part of the natural world, which is a very key part of Odum's contributions, and I think, a key part of why that was so interesting to David Holmgren. Now, to communicate this, he used energy flow diagrams, or energy circuit language symbols. And not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but it would be worth going into. And this is also where some people kind of get lost and they see diagrams and flow diagrams and they lose interest. But it's another skill that I think is important for us to understand process approach to things. And it helps us to visualize inputs and outputs and transformations and feedbacks and storages that we had just been talking about. I'm hearing some sound here. I'm not sure if there's someone I need to mute. It's hard for me to tell when I'm screen sharing who I might need to mute, but.
David, I'm muting people.
Okay, thanks, Brandon. Okay, so yeah, energy flows, stores, transforms, feeds back, and sinks. And these different pieces or symbols that can be used represent those different aspects. A couple of simple examples. One, we have a traditional farm that's like a monoculture, like maybe they're raising cows and that's it. And you see this, the sink aspect of it. This is entropy in all systems, the second law of thermodynamics. Every process, you're going to lose something. The farm feeds the city. It's not enough to sustain our high culture, our high-tech cities as they currently exist. So we need additional inputs. So there's a sign of an oil well, adding inputs to the city. Whereas in a more sustainable system, you get energy from the sun, you live a simpler lifestyle. You have not a monoculture farm, but you have, perhaps, using permaculture or regenerative agriculture, and you're able to support some level of technology, but not the level of technology that we have in our cities today. I'm going to skip over that one. This one, again, is the basic process. You've got an energy source. As that energy source comes into your system, not all of it can be utilized. Some of it is not. Say you get 100 units that goes into your process, and then you've got to put that into production. That creates some storage and structures. There's always the sink, there's used energy, there's loss, and there's depreciation, and then finally there's a yield. Here we got a yield of 10 units of energy from 100 units of energy coming into the system. But this is a transformation process, so the energy quantity is less, but you've created some quality that is of value, and that's what you're after. Okay, the energy language of ecosystems. There's an ecosystem boundary. There's an energy source. That source goes to a primary producer. There's some energy lost to entropy that flows, goes to a primary consumer, then it goes to a secondary consumer, and then a tertiary consumer. You see that these pieces each get smaller, representing a smaller quantity is needed, and they need a larger quantity to feed off of, basically. And there's feedbacks that support the system that they're dependent upon. So the characteristic patterns: reducing energy and mass along the chain, but increasing power and value per the unit of energy and mass that goes along the chain. And essential energy is dissipated in the system in the process. Okay, so now we have an Australian example, since David Holmgren is an Australian, and I got this neat little diagram from him. Sun, rain, and minerals being the energy source, feeding a eucalypt tree. A caterpillar eats the tree leaves. The bird comes in and eats the caterpillars. And iguana comes in and feeds on the birds. So we need more tree leaves than we have caterpillars, and we need more caterpillars than we have birds, and we need more birds than we have iguanas for this ecosystem to remain in appropriate balance. Okay, now moving on to energy quality and embodied energy. So back to the second law of thermodynamics, it's based on this concept of energy quality. Energy can be defined as a quantity that flows through all processes, measured by the amount of heat it becomes. And dispersed heat is the most dilute form of energy. It's what's no longer capable of doing work. And so that's what we basically call entropy. So David Holmgren says that all real processes involve a net degradation in energy quality. However, a proportion of the total energy flow can be upgraded into more concentrated forms of energy capable of driving other processes. The energy basis of nature and humans, there is a relationship between these energies of differing qualities that are fundamental to a correct understanding of the energy basis of nature and human existence. Many kinds of high-quality energy are required for complex work. We tend to think of the energy requirements of a process only as fuel, ignoring human work and the contribution of materials. So we need to take account of more than just, the direct fuel that's being consumed. It's not just, the coal that's feeding our electrical grid, or it's not just the gasoline that's going into an automobile, but it's all the human work and all the processes that came before it that are embodied into that are embedded. The total energy required for a product is the embodied energy of that product. And that's what Odom called emergy. This embodied, I like this quote, the embodied energy of a book is very large compared with the heat energy that would be obtained if the book were burned. So it's pretty ridiculous to think that, if we place an energy value on a book based on measuring the joules of heat that can be obtained by burning the book. The embodied energy of the book, think about it. You've got an author. That author has to be fed and housed and clothed. They have to have time and energy to actually study something to produce a book. That means they don't have to be out there 100% of their time growing their food and meeting their basic sustenance, but they have extra time somehow, for some reason, because there's available energy, that they can actually take time out to go and study. And then you think about our educational institutions, libraries, how much embodied energy goes into maintaining a library, and all the librarians that decide what books get stored, what books need to be republished and kept in circulation versus what can be let go and go out of print. All of these things are a part of what we need to think of as embodied energy. David Holmgren says that a calorie of low quality energy cannot do the same work as a calorie of high quality energy. Little area where people tend to get confused and they just think a calorie is equal to a calorie. That's not the case, because different applications have different functions, and there's these qualitative differences that we need to pay attention to. Now, here we get into a little bit of maybe controversial statements, and we can reflect that this was written in 1994. Maybe technology has continued to change. Maybe some of these statements aren't necessarily true, but I think there's a pretty strong case. Nuclear power may be the greatest example of an energy source which actually uses and/or degrades more humanly usable energy than it produces. And I can say I have a friend who's one of the smartest people I know, who's a retired nuclear physicist who used to work at Hanford, and he agrees with this statement. Solar, wind, and biofuels technologies, while appropriate for the use of already embodied energies that have gone into making them, we need to understand that they will never sustain high energy industrial culture without fossil fuel subsidy. So that, another phrase I've heard is, I think Nate Higgins has said this, yes, renewable energy can power human civilization, just not this one that we're currently living in. Computer technologies may similarly be appropriate to make use of manufacturing and network capacity already in place, but are in reality very energy expensive due to the very large embodied energy. So back to the significance of Howard Odom's work. Again, this book, The Energy Basis of Man and Nature, David Holmgren's comment about it, he says, "It is a very important book which should be read and understood by all permaculturists. Without that understanding, it is very easy to be misled into developing and proposing systems of land use, technology, and lifestyles which will consume rather than produce energy storages useful in providing for current and future human needs. It's a unique tool for understanding and decision-making more in tune with the rules of the natural world. High-energy industrial societies revealed as a quite natural response to fossil fuel abundance, but maladapted in every way to a low-energy future." And this quote was not in the essay, but I pulled this quote from David Holmgren's later book, Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, another highly recommended book. And he has a footnote, again, complimenting Howard Odom. He says, "The most recent book by Howard and Elizabeth Odom, A Prosperous Way Down," referring to this book, published in 2001, he says it is a readable and timely explanation for the lay reader of the emergy concepts and implications of energy transition for the economy, society, and culture. I lost my place. It updates their much earlier, easily accessible text, Energy Basis for Man and Nature. Although I've never had any correspondence with the Odoms, and the manuscripts of this book, his permaculture book, and Odom's book, he says the manuscript of this book was largely complete before the publication of A Prosperous Way Down, Odom's book, but the common understandings informing the two are clear. The strategic difference in our responses to the reality of the transition is that the Odom's emphasis on top-down cultural and public policy change, were directed at a mainstream audience. Permaculture has historically focused on pushing the boundaries of innovating change at the cultural fringe and putting in place real but modest models of living from nature's abundance. Agriculture and forestry. If there's a single most important insight for permaculture from Odom's work, Holmgren writes, it is that solar energy and its derivatives are our only sustainable source of life. Now, this first image I got from the internet, but these next two images were taken when I was at Inspiration Farm. Those of you that were on the activation tour at Inspiration Farm may remember hiking up this trail into the forested area. And David Holmgren says forestry and agriculture are the primary and potentially self-supporting systems of solar energy harvesting available. Okay, now we come to the maximum power principle from Howard Odom. Odom's work is based on a third principle. The system that gets the most energy and uses it most effectively survives in competition with other systems. And quoting directly from Howard Odom, he said, those systems that survive in competition among alternative choices are those that develop more power. And power here, in the physical sense, is defined as the rate of energy flow or energy flow per unit of time. So he says, the systems that survive in competition among alternative choices are those that develop more power inflow and use it to meet the basic needs of survival. Now, how do they do that? And please pay attention to these points, because it's, as I was saying at the beginning, the maximum power principle has, when I do hear people talking about it, they mostly kind of refer to it in like this negative way, that we're all in this competition for power, and so we maximize power by competing against each other and gathering as much resources and using up as much resources as we can. And that is true in the system that we currently live in, and it's true in natural systems when there's abundance of energy, and there's excuse me, when there's a lot of resources available. But it's manifests differently when resources are limited, and that's something we really need to keep in mind. And to make it a little bit less seeming like it's all just about competition, let's pay attention to these, what Odom pointed out about how do systems maximize power. Okay, number one, developing storages of developing storages of high quality energy. Example, in human systems, storages of fossil fuels versus in a more natural system or in an agricultural system. This is stored energy in this bale of hay. That's very important. Number two, they feed back work from storages to increase inflows. Now, here's an offshore oil rig. Imagine all the resources, all the energy that needs to be consumed to build this platform, to supply it with people, the technology required, resources, energy to like drill deep into the ocean. So it's like it takes energy to get energy. And in our current environment, we're relying on more and more of situations like this, because conventional oil, the kind of oil that just, bubbling crude from Texas, is not as abundant and it's in decline. And so we're having to like spend more energy to get energy. And so we're losing our energy return on energy invested. There's still some amount of net energy gained in these systems, but not nearly as much as there used to be. And sometimes there's not an energy gain, but there's an economic gain, and so it's done anyway. Now compare that to a natural system. This again was a photo I took when I was at Inspiration Farm. They were selling goat milk at the time, but they can't just harvest all the goat milk and sell all the goat milk. Some of that energy harvested has to go back into the system to feed it, to keep it going. Point number 3, recycling materials as needed. We're all familiar with, our urban recycling programs, but nature does recycling as well, of course. Number 4 is organizing control mechanisms that keep this system adapted and stable. So here we see, damming a river to try to control and keep it stable to how we would like to see it. And in the natural system, in the natural world, we have predator and prey, and they need to find an appropriate balance to find these control mechanisms that keep the system adapted and stable. Number 5, setting up exchanges with other systems to supply special energy needs. Well, in our current economy, we're dependent on worldwide supply chains and getting the best value we can from Walmart, etc. Here's another way of doing things, the Okanagan family barter fair. Number 6, contributing useful work to the surrounding environmental systems that help maintain favorable conditions. So, here we have microorganisms contributing to the global climate regulation. Here we have mountain forests contributing to rainfall. So this is, a very important principle, that useful work needs to be done in our systems to help maintain favorable conditions. Okay, so a checklist. This is a review of these 6 points. This can be a checklist for sustainable systems. 1, developing storages. 2, feeding back. 3, recycling. 4, organizing control mechanisms. 5, setting up exchanges with other systems. And 6, contributing useful work to the surrounding environmental systems that help maintain favorable conditions. Let's see, I wanted to say something here. To quote David Holmgren, again, it's not on the screen, but again, regarding the maximum power principle, he said that the maximum power principle is contentious and has led some to criticize Odom's work as biophysical determinism, with no room for human values. While this system view is only one way of understanding the world, the last 2 characteristics, number 5 and number 6 especially, of successful natural systems, they allow plenty of scope for cooperative approaches and higher human values. And as we'll see soon, we'll come back to this, it's dependent on the situation, what actually works to maximize power. In a system, when you have abundant resources, imagine kind of a barren landscape with lots of fertilizer. What happens? You get weedy competition, and the weeds compete, and some outcompete other plants. In a stable, mature ecosystem where maybe the resources aren't super abundant, but they are stable in the way that they're dependable, but not super abundant, then you have something more akin to an old growth forest, where the mycelium network is contributing and cooperative to maintain the system. And if you think about those 2 systems, like a weedy landscape versus an old growth forest, which one of those systems is really maximizing power? Which to you seems like it has more power? To me, the old growth forest is, a very majestic example of power in its most healthy expression. Okay, so reviewing Odom's ecosystem approach. Remember these 5 points. Energy flows, it stores, it transforms, it feeds back, and it sinks. Can I get a time check? I'm not seeing I don't have my clock on my computer. How are we doing on time?
You have about 20 minutes.
Great. Okay, thanks, Brandon. So as some of you will know, Bill Mollison is the other co-founder of Permaculture. And David Holmgren in his essay references Mollison. And he says he made a passing reference to Odom where he said, the concept of entropy does not necessarily apply to living open earth systems with which we are involved and in which we are immersed. Now, Holmgren has a little critique of that. He says this could be wrongly interpreted as meaning that we can design our way out of any problem and that natural systems can sustain the continuous free lunch the affluent world is used to. The most productive sustainable systems imaginable may be able to provide for the needs of 5 or even 10 billion people. However, they would never sustain large-scale cities, a global economy, and Western material affluence, even if all the conventional energy conservation strategies were to be adopted. This is a bitter pill to swallow for Westerners raised on the notion of material progress. The transition from an unsustainable fossil fuel-based economy back to a solar-based agriculture and forestry economy will involve the application of the embodied energy that we inherit from industrial culture. This embodied energy is contained within a vast array of things, infrastructure, cultural processes, and ideas, mostly inappropriately configured for the solar economy. It is the task of our age to take this great wealth, reconfigure, and apply it to the development of sustainable systems. Now, Mollison's 3 guidelines. The systems we construct should last as long as possible and take the least maintenance. These systems, fueled by the sun, should produce not only for their own needs, but the needs of the people creating and controlling them. Thus, they are sustainable as long as they sustain both themselves and those who construct them. We can use non-renewable energy to construct these systems, providing that in their lifetime they store or conserve more energy than we use to construct or maintain them. So, I'm sorry, I missed that last point. How then should we assess whether we are following these 3 guidelines? Well, here Holmgren uses perspectives derived from Odom to make those evaluations. All terrestrial ecosystems must work to slow the inexorable effects of gravity. And here I'm thinking of you, Brian, and your work with water, how you've really perfectly demonstrated the importance of this. Eventually, everything ends up in the oceans until the next uplift. Water and nutrients are the key forms of chemical energetic potential. The landform itself is the key expression of the physical energy potential. Soil humus and long-lived trees are the key energy storages. So then we come to Holmgren's sustainability test. I've moved ahead a little bit in his essay. I'm not reading every word, but we're nearing the end of his essay, and he offers this sustainability test. Does the system work to catch and store water and nutrients for as long as possible and as high as possible within its catchment landscape? How does it compare with the performance of pristine natural systems, as well as wild and naturally regenerated ones, weeds included? It is possible for managed productive landscapes to collect and store energy more effectively than pristine systems by the careful use of external often non-renewable energies. And he says most of our managed rural landscapes, especially farms, fail miserably on the water and nutrients test. Erosion, salinity, acidification, and stream and groundwater nutrient pollution are some of the symptoms. Okay, what about wild productivity? Any systems which can improve soil and water values and require little or no fossil fuel energy to develop and maintain, and provide resource yields largely by the application of human labor and skill, should be seen as our greatest assets. And I think this is, a key point that resonates with the work that we're all trying to see happen with regenerating Cascadia. Okay, what about urban landscapes? Despite all of their disadvantages, the he acknowledges the disadvantages of urban landscapes. But this is one of the, I think, kind of one of the genius aspects of David Holmgren being able to envision improvement. He says the low density nature of suburbs makes them incrementally adaptable to a low energy future. And these two photos you probably can't really read very well, but on the left you have just kind of what he calls the late 1950s golden age of the suburban dream, where, kind of cookie cutter, they all look pretty much the same, but they're on large lots. And so there's potential. The image on the right says late 2000s permaculture retrofit. And there's just various, people doing different things, able to apply permaculture even to small suburban lots. And this was more fully developed in his most recent book called Retro Suburbia. The limits to productivity. Okay, so capital inputs to establish sustainable systems may be confined to a brief, intense developmental phase. Human effort is required over much longer periods, possibly a lifetime, before it declines, or more correctly, evolves into a careful and quiet stewardship. So he's bringing a little bit of realism into sometimes maybe some of the hyperbolic claims of what permaculture can do. He says permaculture systems will never be highly productive on very low levels of labor input, such as that required to maintain a well-designed ornamental garden of local native plants. The search for systems which continually reduce human effort is also a recipe for human alienation and the technological fix. So don't be lulled into, thinking it's necessarily just an easy life and easy ways out. He says Odom suggests that all information systems also have a high embodied energy cost. We should assume that at the material level at least, productivity of sustainable systems will not be vastly different from traditional examples from the past. This may be a very uncomfortable realization for all of us, raised on the mythology of material progress and human invincibility. Okay, now I'd like to spend a few minutes on, I've inserted this into the presentation. This is not part of his 1994 essay, but in the early 2000s, he wrote another book. Called Future Scenarios. So a little brief detour into Holmgren's concept of future scenarios. Well, this quote is actually from his essay, but it's leading into a little bit more. He says, if net energy is declining, as more people have come to realize is the case, then attempts to maintain materialist culture based on growth economics are counterproductive, irrespective of any moral judgments. The permaculture strategy of using existing storages of energy, materials, technology, and information to build cultivated ecosystems which efficiently harvest solar energy is precisely adaptive. So where are we going? So here on the vertical axis, we have energy and resource use, population and pollution. And on the horizontal axis, we see historical time. So this is what we've been used to. And we have the pre-industrial sustainable culture, and then our current recent past of industrial ascent or modernism. It's all we've experienced for a very long time is continuous growth. Can this be sustained? Well, we may be reaching the climax. So now let's look at future time. Well, some believe in what might be called a techno fantasy. Perhaps this might be, in my view, a little bit of denial. I think we might agree on that. Where, the techno optimist, we can just continue growing. It's what we've done in the past. Technology will solve our problems. We just gotta, keep a positive attitude and keep investing. Or there's the green tech stability option, where we might have to reduce a little bit, but then we can stabilize at a high level of material affluence, right? The green fix, use less energy and resources, but an expectation of reaching a sustainability that just basically preserves what we have. Well, there is a radical element of this in that, just to come down a little bit and to not be continuing to grow, that in itself is a pretty radical concept for a lot of people. There's another concept, though, that we can call earth stewardship, that we come past this climax and we go down quite in a somewhat similar way as we came up. And finally, there's the Mad Max scenario, where we push it as far as we can. We go a little bit higher, trying to reach this techno fantasy, but at some point, and we're not prepared for it. And then there's like this sudden cliff where it's almost come straight down, and got a Mad Max future. One presenter going through this material, talked about the psychological aspects of techno fantasy being in denial. Green tech stability being, that we can kind of maybe change our light bulbs, but still go on holiday to the Canary Islands. Kind of a bargaining type of a situation. Earth stewardship, maybe that's a more sane acceptance of what we got in store for us. And then the Mad Max scenario being a polarity of either anger and or despair. So where might you fall on these projections and these trajectories? Where do you foresee? So David Holmgren was really trying to get us to see this idea of creative descent using permaculture, earth stewardship. And I think this is the path of bioregional regeneration, transition initiatives, permaculture. I think this is what we need to be trying to plan for, using the best ideas we have and doing as much as we can to avert the Mad Max scenario. This is a slide from Charles Hall, who was a student of Howard Odom's. Where on the left side, again, this is what we're used to. Most of our economic and financial theories were derived during this period, and so that's what they're applied to. We're now in this period of this bumpy plateau, in this climax period. We're coming to a time of decline. So what are the economic theories that would be appropriate for this steep decline? We haven't developed those. And again, this is, I think, where we need to think of the context of the maximum power principle. Sure, competitive maximizing of power through hoarding of resources and fighting over them and having wars, it got you somewhere. But those strategies don't really apply when resources are in decline. So what will apply? And Howard Odum himself even acknowledged this and talked about it. He noticed in his very first paper on the maximum power principle that when resources are not abundant, that the systems that survive are those that cooperate well. And he called it the survival of the spendthrift. So Howard Odum was not all about, competition and survival of the fittest. He was trying to show us and explain to us, why the survival of the fittest thing applies and how it applies in terms of being able to maximize power. But it's really, the context and circumstance you're in, and we're coming into a period where I think, as I think we're starting, some of us are starting to see, like, is the war in Ukraine, is Russia really gonna, are they gonna be able to maximize power? Are they gonna come out, with a pot of gold at the end? Is anyone? Based on war? I don't think so anymore. So what economic theories are appropriate here? And I really appreciated Benjamin Life's presentation. I think one of the first presentations yesterday on global governance, and we need to think from the ground up. Okay, our conclusion. The complexity and severity of environmental and economic crises make it more imperative than ever before that we have a common currency for understanding the changes around us and assessing the available options. That currency is energy. So to summarize, this was written a little bit before David Holmgren published Permaculture Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability, I believe. He said, refuse, reduce, reuse, repair, recycle, in that order. Grow a garden and eat what it produces. Avoid imported resources where possible. Use labor and skill in preference to materials and technology. Design, build, and purchase for durability and repairability. Use resources for the greatest potential use, i.e., use electricity for tools and lighting, food scraps for animal feed. And use renewable resources whenever possible, even if local environmental costs appear higher. So he was suggesting things like, burning wood for fuel. That contributes to local air pollution, but then, you have to experience the consequences of your actions rather than, exporting waste and pollution somewhere else, in the coal firing plants that are creating the electricity that comes across the grid and appears to be clean when you use it. So he says wood rather than electricity for fuel, and timber rather than steel for construction. Use non-renewable and embodied energies primarily to establish sustainable systems, e.g. passive solar housing, food gardens, water storage, forests. When using high technology, avoid using state-of-the-art equipment. That's a tough one sometimes, huh? Avoid debt and long-distance commuting. I had like this one. You can reduce taxation by earning less and develop a home-based lifestyle and be domestically responsible. Okay, so this presentation was adapted by myself from the essay Energy and Permaculture by David Holmgren. I put a link in the chat at the beginning to the original essay. This link here is no longer current. That got replaced. Recommended books: Energy Basis for Man and Nature, Prosperous Way Down, Permaculture.
David, just to let you know, you're at about 1 minute left.
Okay. These are the books. I recommend them all. And yeah, thank you for your time and attention. Thank you for being the change. Thank you for remembering that energy flows, stores, transforms, feeds back, and sinks.
And
All right.
thank you for presenting.
Thank you. I'm sorry we didn't have time for questions, I guess.
David, much appreciated.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. It's good to have the big picture and put this into perspective in our daily lives and how we move through space and time.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian.
I'm curious if they're going to kick us out, or I had a quick